My name is Pam McNerney, and I am one of your event hosts for this evening. And I'm pleased to welcome you to Imagining the Life of Isabella Stewart Gardner, an evening with Emily Franklin in conversation with Kara Sundlun. Emily is the author of more than 20 novels and a poetry collection, Tell Me How You Got It. Her award-winning work has appeared in the New York Times, Boston Globe, and numerous literary magazines, as well as featured and read aloud on NPR and named notable by the Association of Jewish Libraries. A lifelong visitor to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, she lives outside of Boston with her family, including 2 dogs large enough to be lions. And Kara is a 3-time Emmy award-winning journalist. You can catch her live every weekday as a co-host of Great Day Connecticut with Scott Haney at 3 p.m. on Channel 3. She's also the chief digital anchor, bringing you breaking news as it happens on air and on WFSB Plus. She anchors Eyewitness News at noon and the afternoon rush at 4 o'clock. So we will have the books on sale following this discussion and the signing line. And we ask that you please purchase the books first before getting into the signing line. So books will be for sale. Do we have any more at this register?
We do.
Okay, a few more at this register and some on the other side. If we do run out of books, we would be happy to sell you the book, and then it'll be delivered soon, and then we can give you a book plate to get signed tonight, and you can just put the plate into the book. You can, if you have any questions, you can let me or the other event host, Jackie, who's right here, and we will walk you through that. And now for Emily Franklin in conversation with Kara. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm really excited to be here and to be in conversation with Emily Franklin. I had the opportunity to meet Emily over the summer in idyllic Newport, where she was doing a book signing, and I imagine that that's sort of where the Lioness was.
It was a very Isabella evening.
It was, yes. I think that there were people who, their grandmothers and grandparents, they knew her.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It was a garden party that Isabella would really love.
Yes. So we were really excited to have Emily on Great Day Connecticut today. I don't know if some of you saw her or saw that she was going to be reading. But I'm going to ask some questions. Emily's going to do some reading, and then of course we'll save time for anything that you might want to ask. There's so many of you, so thank you for coming and supporting reading and supporting R.J. Julia. It's such a great bookstore, right? So I'm going to start with just a basic question, and I may have we might have already alluded to this on TV, but I want to ask it for this crowd. But what brought you to want to write this book? Why did you write this book?
Well, my answer is multi-part. Okay. So how many people in this audience, just out of curiosity, have ever been to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum? Okay, so a bunch of people, many people. So it's not going to be a surprise then that the first time I went there as a child, I grew up half in London and half in Boston, and I used to go to the museum with my dad. It was really our special place that we would go to. The first time I went there, that interior courtyard, I thought it was magic. I mean, I actually thought it was inhabited by like fairy people. It was just, it's incredible. And so the first thing that really captivated me was that, and it was really, as a kid, I felt like it was the outside becoming the inside. And that was a very unusual thing. And looking back now, I understand that it was really part of Isabella's goal was to erase these boundaries between places and spaces and people. And so bringing the outside inside was just part of that. And then I wandered around that museum and I saw, you know, not only these masterworks of art, you've got Botticelli, and you've got, you know, Titian and John Singer Sargent, who she became really good friends with, but there are also desks and vases and tapestries. And, you know, I don't know when the last time you were there, but there were approximately 14,000 chairs in that. There's so many chairs. She had a chair problem, I think. And there are these priceless Duncan Pike chairs, and there are also very simple, basic metal garden chairs. And that also speaks to this part of Isabella that touched me really very much so as a child, which is this was a museum that was unlike any other museum I was sort of dragged to as a child, which is, you know, anything could be art. And so that was really exciting to me. And the other thing that, you know, I noticed is that there are no placards on the wall. And the other thing that my dad had explained to me that, you know, the reason why she didn't have that is because she didn't want people to go in, and when we see, you know, a Renoir on the wall of the MFA, we not only understand the times and dates and the artist, we're really supposed to look at that information as a way to know which painting is more important than another. And Isabella didn't want that. She wanted us to go and just experience and have this immersive time there. And so that was part of it for me. And then in March of 1990, my art history class took a field trip to the museum. And I sat in this very cavernous Dutch room and I wrote a paper on Rembrandt's Storm in the Sea of Galilee and Vermeer's The Concert. And then 10 days later, those paintings were cut from their frames and stolen in one of the largest art heists in history.
That was the. Right
And so
there.
I will say that, so I've been on book tour for this novel since April. And as I told Kara today, at every event that I've done recently, I've been asked if I know where the stolen is. And I think that's a very funny question to ask me. I don't know where it is. It's a $10 million reward. If I did know, I think I would be chasing that down. But that heist, like so many people in Boston, I felt very close to that heist, not because I had anything to do with it. I was there at the time. But because other people were really interested in where the artwork went. And I was really interested in these empty frames that are still hanging. And I was very captivated by the fact that these empty frames will hang forever because of the way that Isabella structured her will, that nothing can ever be moved or changed, or Harvard gets everything. They get the museum, its contents, and even the land underneath it. And so these empty frames are there, which as I aged, and then I went on and wrote many books, and this is my 24th novel, and I had many, many children and many dogs. Those empty frames are still there. And what it really became for me was a metaphor of loss. You know, if another museum has a golden goblet under glass and that golden goblet is stolen, you know, a couple of days or a couple of weeks later, the empty case is removed and we basically forget that anything had ever been there. But because the empty frames are still there, we'll never forget what was once hanging in there, and we'll never forget the loss of those things. You know, and nobody gets out of here alive. And so we all have these sort of metaphorical empty frames that we carry around with us. And that was really something that stuck with me. And then a few years ago, a couple of years before the pandemic, I went back to the museum to research a completely different story. And while I was there, I just rekindled this fascination with this woman. And I realized that so many people knew more about the artwork in the museum than the woman who had built it. And she was the first woman in the United States to open up a museum. And I would go home at night and I would tell my children and my husband, you know, this was a woman who camped in the Middle East and she experienced terrible personal tragedy and she was rejected from Boston society, but she triumphed and she went to Harvard lectures, which were all male as a female at the time, which was unheard of. And she just was friends with Henry James and John Singer Sargent. You know, she lived this incredible life. Somebody should really write a novel about her. And my husband would just look at me like, maybe don't meet somebody who could do that. And so I decided that I would do that. So that's my long-winded answer for that.
Yeah, wonderful. And I know, I don't know if you want to do that now. I know you're going to read a little bit. Do you want to do that now, or do you want to do a couple more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I know sometimes when authors say that they're going to read, everybody has a little bit of clutch of panic of like, oh God, are we going to be sitting in here? The sun's going to be rising. I'm going to be like, page 342.
She's going to read a little bit.
A tiny section. It's about 3 minutes, 2.5 minutes.
Yeah.
So just don't panic.
Take 4.
So all you really need to know for this scene, the novel is structured such that it begins with a prologue of the 84-year-old Isabella looking back on her life. And then I'm not going to read from that part. I'm going to read from the next section, which starts in 1861. And Isabella Stewart Gardner is just newly married. She's 20 years old and she's moved to Boston. She was born in New York, went to finishing school in Paris, and now she's moved to Boston, having married Jack Gardner. And she's moved to Boston with very high hopes. And those hopes are quickly dashed when society has rejected her. So all you need to know for this scene is Isabella is going to a dinner party and she is dreading it. Evenings collected Putnams and Elliots, Amory's, Cabots, Lowells, Warrens, Hallowells, Welds, and others, families Oliver Wendell Holmes had summed up as Brahmins in his recent novel, as though they were all interchangeable, elite without uniqueness. I felt a growing despair with this. I wanted the belonging and yet loathed the neediness that ensnared me. The idea that to be integral meant being one of them, and by definition, thus not myself, even if I wasn't yet quite sure of who that was either. One of the many rules for dinner parties, none of the diners ought to feel superior to the others, and yet I felt myself on the lowest rung. We entered the drawing room on the heels of Miss Appleton, whose complexion glowed rosy atop her pale champagne dress, ringlets bobbing and dancing in the light like a sea creature, beautiful and deadly. Mrs. Amory in green silk pierced through with tidy navy ribbon embraced Miss Appleton warmly. We waited a moment so as not to intrude, which was fine for Jack. Men may stand and look around the room and are assumed to be thinking, perhaps measuring the room's dimensions. But women stand and often feel foolish, as though we are lost, or in my view, as though we are somehow always in the wrong place. I wore a dress that had arrived the day before, sent from Douceur in Paris, where I had first visited with my parents and Jack's sister Julia back when we were still in school. Now I saw Miss Appleton take in the yardage of my outfit, knit too much at the waist for Boston, lined with buttons on either side. I had thought the sketches glorious, different, and only now realized difference ought never be the goal. Miss Appleton's eyes wandered over my dress as she held her stunning face statue still. How unusual. Beautiful people can afford a touch of cruelty. Other guests arrived, comfortable in the house as regulars in the dinner party rotation. The room was grand in the understated Boston way. Upholstered fine furniture, lighting neither too bright nor too dim, nothing too showy, nothing that appeared recently acquired, for part of the custom of this realm was to present the self and one's house as always having been this way. I was the only new addition.
Just out of curiosity, how many of you have either watched the Netflix series The Heist or are watching The Gilded Age? Yeah, a lot of you watching The Gilded Age. So it reminds me, and I'm someone who has spent a lot of time. For those who know me, I spent a lot of time in Newport. That's where my father was from, and so I know that world, that old world where nothing ever changes and the grand dames are still entertaining the way that they were. And my first experience as a teenager showing up, I totally get the, okay, what do we do here? Because it is a different set of rules. But I'm just curious, why was she so rejected from society?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of different reasons. The first is she was an outsider, as I said. So she was born in New York, went to finishing school in Paris. Boston was a very closed society and much more puritanical than fancy New York. And so that was part of it. The other part of it was, so she met Jack through Julia Gardner, Jack's sister, who she had gone to finishing school with in Paris. And when she would come visit Julia, it's where she met Jack. She got into some social situations that I don't think she understood would haunt her for the rest of her life. So, for example, there was one situation where a prince had come to town and there was a ball and everybody had been invited. And the prince asked Isabella to say the dance for him, which she did. And they had a lovely time dancing and flirting. And she only learned after the fact that the dance that she had had with him had been promised to a different Boston Brahmin daughter. So Boston never forgot that. Boston really held a grudge. But the main reason that she was rejected is she really had tons of opinions and she was not shy about expressing them. And these were opinions on, situations that were really considered to be the purview of men. She was interested and intellectual and curious and outspoken, and all of those things were really not what women were supposed to be at the time.
Did she have, were her parents alive? Did she have, like, I think of Gilded Age, where they're trying to raise the daughters to be just the right way? Did she have a mother or father who were
Her
trying to
parents
save
were
her?
still alive, but they, sent her to finishing school in Paris.
So they thought that was going to work.
Scottish. They were outsiders also.
Okay, just curious. How long did it take you to write the book with the research?
All told, it took me 3.5 years. And remind me at the end, I have a funny story about selling the book. But yes, It did take me about 3.5 years. It was a lot of research, but I was a very academic sort of nerdy, bookish child, and I still find the research so fun. So I have to really learn when to stop researching, because if, I want to know everything about street lamps in Boston in 1861 and all of the decorative details. And then I have to remind myself that not everybody in the audience actually wants to know all of the details that I know. They just want like one sentence that is very convincing about those details. And so I really did a ton of research about Isabella, about Boston, because Boston history is a huge part of this. It's really its own character in there. You get to see the opening of the Swan boats and the first Boston Symphony Orchestra performance and Perkins School for the Blind and Mass General Hospital. All of these things are being built and happening at the same time. She meets Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and, Henry James and John Singer Sargent, and you've got just so much happening.
What years are?
Yeah, so it starts in 1861 and it goes until the opening of the museum in 1903.
Okay, so that also would.
And then there's an epilogue that takes place. Spoiler alert, she opens a museum and then she dies at the end of the book. You know these things, this is not really a spoiler. But so the museum opens in 1903, we get to see that, and then we have a little bit of an epilogue afterwards.
Yeah.
So it's a huge span of time, and there's tons of stuff that's happening in Boston. And because she had this love affair with Europe, she traveled all the time. And so we get to go camping with her in the Middle East, which she did, and go to Venice many, many times. She goes to the first Impressionist exhibit, so you get to see everybody in there. There's just a ton of detail and history in there, but in what I hope is a very sort of page-turny kind of way.
Yeah. Well, and she had tragedies, and I don't know if you're going to reveal
I'm
that.
not going to reveal the sorrows that she experiences, just because it is a novel, so it's not a biography. So I feel like I wouldn't want to know everything that I'm about to read in a novel, even though it's her life. But she does have these tragedies that she experiences, and from that really rises out of the tragedy to explore the next part of her life.
And I find it fascinating because it's a novel, but it's a historical novel. So a lot of what we're reading is accurate.
Yes.
And then the rest is your story. How do we know when we're reading which
Right.
is which?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I tried to think about this was I tried to stay very true to the backbone of Isabella Stewart Gardner's life. So the plot points in here really are true. There are some details that I might have shifted, or some scenes that I might have played around with, but nothing major happens in here that didn't happen to her in real life. But I'll tell you that, for example, so I'll talk about the Impressionist scene. So there is a chapter that's set at the first Impressionist exhibit in Paris in 1873, and it unfolds in the book the way that it did in real life. It took place at a photographer's studio. His name was Nadar. And everybody was there. There was Renoir and Monet and Manet and Degas and Pissarro and Bertha Morisot. And I have Isabella there, and she's interacting with everybody. And the reason why I chose to have her do this is a couple of reasons. So that really did happen like that, but Isabella wasn't there. She was in Paris at the time, but she didn't attend. And the reason, as a fiction writer, that I have to make those choices is because of all the artists that I mentioned who are there. The one that I think we all know the least about here, even if there's an art scholar in here, because it's a very erudite crowd, is Bertha Morisot. And the reason we know the least about her is she was the only woman.
Yeah.
And to have a woman who is so deeply invested in art and in bringing art to the public, which was really Isabella's mission, was to make art accessible to the public. I really wanted to have her interact with another woman who was going through that very same thing, and to show, first of all, this incredible exhibit before they were even known as the Impressionists, and to sort of be able to display that. But then to have Isabella start to question her role as a woman and in the arts. And so I have to make those decisions. And, I often think back, there's an E.L. Doctorow quote that I thought about a lot when I was writing this, which is, the historian will tell you what happened, and the novelist will tell you what it felt like. And that's where I keep making those decisions about.
Why did she love art so much? Was she at all an artist herself?
She wasn't an artist herself. I think the first thing that drew her to art were artists. So Isabella, because of her rejection and never quite fitting into society, I think she really gravitated towards other people who existed at society's edges,
Okay.
and artists were some of those people. So she was now really probably would have been called an early ally. You know, she had a lot of friends who were artists, who were gay, who were different in some way, but that's how society perceived them. And so I think she came to art through the artists, but really just fell in love with the storytelling nature of everything. And when she began collecting, that's what she was really doing, was creating a life story through art and objects. And so I think even though she wasn't an artist, she left this museum for everybody that really is a masterwork of art made out of other people's art.
Why the title? Was she called the Lioness, or is that?
It was not, that is my creation, but there are a couple of reasons. So the old entrance to the museum, the original entrance was the front door was flanked by 2 stone lions. And I knew when I was writing the book that I wanted it to be grounded in Boston, because she had this love-hate relationship with Boston. Eventually she and Boston fell in love, but it took the whole novel to get there. But there's also this great picture of her, and there are all these, she was a widely mythologized person. She really was a celebrity before celebrity. And so Boston sort of loathed her at the beginning and then couldn't get enough of her in the gossip magazines of the time. And there really are these gossip magazines from the 1800s. It was like, Isabella shocks again, so tawdry. And she wore a low-cut dress and all these different things. But there's a great sketch of her that was in the Globe, and she's walking a pair of lions. And we don't know, again, whether this was real lions. So the question that some scholars have is
crazy animals.
she didn't exactly. We don't know exactly whether this was something she truly did, or this is the sort of thing she would have done. I actually think she probably did walk lions on a leash, because I think this seems like exactly the kind of stunt she would have pulled. And then the lions definitely would have listened to her. And anyway, so it's great. There's a great sketch of her, 1891 from the Globe, and she is just walking a lion on a leash. And the headline says, Mrs. Gardner's latest lion. And so I thought, the Lioness of Boston, it connotes strength, and she was a really strong person to survive the stuff that she did. So
Yeah. I mean, it does remind me, for those who are watching the Gilded Age, and they have Mrs. Vanderbilt, who would later become, nobody would think that Newport's not synonymous with the Vanderbilts. When she first tried to come into society, no one would even have dinner with her, and she couldn't even come around. And now it's the Vanderbilt this and the Vanderbilt. And so it's interesting that we're all interested in this type of thing right now. Do you think, we talked about this on the show, that if there were influencers back then, she would have been one?
She would have been. I mean, if Isabella were around today, she'd be tweeting, she'd be live streaming herself, and doing selfies of herself at the museum, and then discussing how meta that was. I think she was really just an interesting person, and very self-referential and very quirky. I mean, this is a woman who not only, I signed a book for somebody, I don't know if they're here tonight, but I signed a book in advance for somebody who wanted it made out to Isabella. And obviously, if your name is Isabella, you have lifetime free admission to the museum. That is something that she set up. She's a quirky lady. Yeah, so that was one thing. And I'll tell you another quirky thing that she did. So when she first moved to Boston, during that scene, she and Jack first moved to Boston and moved into 152 Beacon Street. The house was given to her by her father as a wedding gift. And eventually she gets so much stuff, she acquires so much art and so many objects that there's not enough room on the walls for her to display everything. And she used to host these lectures and musical soirees. And so Jack bought the house next door, and they knocked through to have enough space. When they left there to move into what we now call the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, was originally called Fenway Court. When they moved to Fenway Court, when they went to move there, they moved out of Beacon Street, and first they moved to Green Hill in Brookline. And when they left there, she thought, I lived at 152 Beacon Street. No one else should ever live at 152 Beacon Street. So you can do your sleuthing and find the building. It still exists, but the number 152 is no longer, because she did not want anybody else to live.
She had it removed. Wow. It's a different address now.
Yeah. So she just had her own vision and her own ideas about things. She did have siblings, and she outlived them all. And that is in 1891. That's when she came into her family's money, and that is when she began very seriously acquiring art.
And where did the fortune come from?
They made their money largely by importing Irish linen.
Oh, that's a big thing.
It was really big, apparently. I know we're gonna take questions from the audience.
Question or two from you? and then-
Yeah, I'm gonna share one quirky
I
little
wanna
story.
know- Yes,
Okay.
because you know best.
So,
what
no,
we
I'm
don't know.
gonna just share something, about
Yeah.
her magic powers. So, yes, so my literary agent, so an agent for people who maybe don't know, when I finish a book, I send it to my literary agent and it is his job to then submit it to publishers and they decide whether they want to make an offer to put it out in the world, to buy it and put it out in the world. So, and Kara knows my agent. And so Esmond is very, very British. And
His
I
last
had
name is Harmsworth. He has a lot-
Esmond. Yes, his name is Esmond. And
He has a garden party
he's
for
a garden party. He's delightful. Anyway, so Esmond, we had sent the novel out, and this was during the pandemic. And so, like everything else, everything took a very long time, and publishing was no exception. And so the publishers had the novel, and we were hearing nothing. It was just crickets. And so Esmond kept saying, don't worry, Tommy, it's going to sell. It's just taking time. Just be patient. Don't lose it. Don't lose it. And I didn't want to lose hope. So my husband, as a very nice surprise that fall, right when things were starting to open up again, we went in our masks and went to go see the Titian exhibit at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And I'm extremely close with my dad, and I have 4 kids, and my husband arranged to have them all show up and surprise me there, which was so fun. And so we all went in our masks, and I said, while we're here, let's go visit with my favorite portrait of Isabella, which is actually not the one that one of the ones that John Singer Sargent did, although those are very famous. I actually love the one that Anders Zorn, who is a Swedish painter that she met at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Also where the zipper was introduced, for those who actually want to know the extent to my nerdy research. It's very exciting. But so she meets Anders Zorn and she sort of takes him under her wing, and he paints her in Venice. And it's the painting where she's sort of standing in the doorway like this, and she's wearing a white dress, and she's just alive and glowing and so happy. So I said to my dad and my kids and all the random people around, oh, let's go visit with her. And so I stood in front of her portrait, and I had my mask on, and I just had, my eyes, I decided to lock eyes with her portrait and just have a little conversation in my head. And it's funny because the portrait, even though the museum is so grand and there are these giant rooms, this particular portrait is in what's called the short corridor. It's just a very small little pass-through, chock-a-block full of paintings. And so I stood there talking to her in my head, and I just sort of said, hello. And then I said, I wrote a book about you. It hasn't sold. I said, but I had a great time researching your life, and I just want to thank you for everything that you've done for women and for Boston and for the arts and for creating this magical place. And I hope at some point that my book will be out in the world and more people will know about the important contribution that you made to the art world and to life in general. At which point my phone rang and Esmond said, darling, you just sold it. And my dad, Mr. Math and Science man, screamed a little bit too, because they could all hear it, and everybody around just, it's very eerie indeed. And so I keep thinking now, should I go back and be like, Meryl Streep hasn't signed on yet?
Well, I'm a big believer in signs, so however it all, and we're doing your book signing on 12/12, which is a magical day, so you
I
might
didn't
want to
know
go back.
that.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
So it's all over the internet. 12/12 is a magical day. Make your intention. So you just did. Like Kate Winslet or Meryl Streep.
Well, I feel like it's a 3-parter, right? We've got early, middle,
Oh,
late.
yeah, that makes sense. It's in different ages.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure we have time. There's so many of you. So just raise your hands and we'll be able to, let's start with you.
I'd like to know why you chose or how you chose first person to tell her story instead of.
Yep, that's a great question. So when I first, unlike so many novels or short stories that I've written or other things, the first words of this novel were the prologue, and it's almost exactly how it came out. Very little editing over the prologue. So I always knew that the prologue was going to be in the first person. But then I thought it would go to the third person. And so I tried that, and I had written a couple of chapters, and I thought, well, this isn't working. And here's why it wasn't working. I mean, there are two reasons. The first is, at the beginning of the novel, as I said, Isabella is very rejected. And so it's very tricky to write in the third person when somebody has no friends. Because what are they doing? Nothing. So it'd be like, she walked alone to the park. She looked around the park and was alone. Still, she was alone. With her friend, it was also alone. It really wasn't working. And then the other part of that was, so I didn't want the past, because it is long ago. I wanted it to feel really close. And because part of, I think, what's exciting about historic fiction is feeling like you are experiencing it as it's happening. And I think the best way for me to do that is a close first person. And I really wanted to be able to show Isabella's thought process and really get inside her head. And I think to do that is very tricky to do that if you're not using first person. So that's why.
I want to take more questions, but I want to ask one question. Do you have a favorite author, at least in this genre? Is there someone that you admire?
Oh, well, probably, I mean, you can tell, so the cover art inspiration, I love Immortals. And so this cover was, I asked the art department to pay close attention to A Gentleman in Moscow. So if you look at the cover, it's very close related to, it's sort of the mirror opposite to that.
Okay, okay. More questions? Yes.
I wonder, well, there's been a lot of talk about art pieces and artifacts being returned to where they came from because they were taken under, suspect circumstances. How did she acquire most of her objects that are in the museum? Did she have any kind of thoughts on how to get them legitimately, or
Yeah.
did you run across?
Again, so I don't represent the museum, but I think they've
Right.
done my understanding is that they've done a very careful evaluation of the art and objects that are in there. And I don't think there are as many problematic pieces there as there have been in other places. I do know, so for example, her Japanese art collection, she was very close friends with, a Japanese artist and Okura, who helped her acquire so many of the pieces in there. So I think it was probably due to her personal connection to places that she had so many special objects. And the other thing is that some of those objects that are in there are just fragments or bits of things or a goblet that she just liked, that don't have real, they have value now because they've been in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, but at the time they were just bits and pieces of things that she just really enjoyed.
I just want to add, those of you who know my husband, Dennis House, who now is an anchor at Channel 8, he, if you're interested in this, some of you may have seen it, but Robert Gentile was accused of he's the mobster in Connecticut from Waterbury, was accused of stealing the art. And long story, everyone wanted this interview, but Robert Gentile's wife, like Dennis, said she watched him growing for years and years. So right before he died, he gave the interview to Dennis. He says he didn't do it and doesn't know where the art is, but yet there are maps and conversations we had with people. So if you wanted to do, I was looking up the thing to see if it's easy. If you could Google Dennis House Robert Gentile, it comes up if you want a little bit more about this feeling. I did ask, what do you think? And I won't tell you, you can judge Dennis's face. There's no proof of it, but he did have a lot of conversations about the art. So it's a little strange. More questions from the audience? Yes, way back there.
What was your favorite factoid that you learned about Isabella with your research?
My favorite factoid. Gosh, there are so many things that I learned about her, but I guess I really didn't know how close she had been with her sisters-in-law, and that was very exciting to me. I have two brothers, and it was just so fun to read about her relationships with Harriet and Julia. Yeah.
So when you were doing your research, did you find that there were other objects, paintings, anything that's in the archives that are not currently on display? And were you given any special access to parts of the museum or to anything because of what you were doing with it?
So I think everything that is there because they can't move anything. I mean, they can't hide anything, because I think that probably goes against they can move it. For example, they had a Becoming Isabella exhibit. And they sort of can put things in a special display room, but I'm not sure that they're allowed to put pieces of art away, because that sort of removes them from the public eye. So I'm not quite sure of the sort of specifics of how she left her will, but so I think my understanding is everything is as it was. And then in terms of being able to go to places or see things that other people can't see, there are tons of objects that I used there. The database that's online is actually excellent. So you can look up there are 7,500 objects and works of art, and there are 1,500 rare books. She first started collecting by collecting rare books. And you can find all of the sort of pieces of information about each specific object or work of art on there, the provenance. But when I would come across provenance unknown, it was just gold for a fiction writer, because I could make it up. If you don't know, you can't tell me that Henry James didn't give it to her. So I'm going to make a scene around that. But in terms of hidden parts of the museum, there's her private apartment is the 4th floor. And I actually got to have coffee with somebody who grew up in the museum. And so she and I had coffee. Her dad had been the head of the museum at the time of the robbery. And so she grew up there, Sarah, and we had.
Who did she think took the stuff?
Do you?
Actually, the people who kind of run the museum, do they have an opinion?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't really know. But that apartment upstairs is off limits. But I did, one of the head of the Gardner security came to hear a book reading, and he has told me, we've been in email contact since. And he said, anytime I want to go to that 4th floor and see where she lived, I can do that. So I'm just waiting for the right time to do it.
You should go there and then talk to the painting about.
I should.
Yes.
I'm going to share with you my own personal recollection. It doesn't touch on the art, it touches on music. When I was a little girl, that's where my mother took me to Mrs. Jack's Palace every Sunday afternoon for concerts. And that's where I became interested and knowledgeable about music. My focus when we went there was not the art as a child, but the music. Later on, of course, my appreciation grew, and I love your recollection. And is anyone else who's been there remember the hanging nasturtiums?
Oh, the hanging nasturtiums are always done in April, because that's her birthday month. So April 14th is her birthday, and she wanted to have those 30-foot long nasturtiums, some of which are still from her original. Yes.
Wow.
And the other thing she does on April 14th is have a giant gong rung to say happy birthday.
Really?
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's every April 14th.
Yes, it's directed.
Things that's
Part of
part
it.
of her directive, yes, but that's a wonderful recollection. And she was a huge music supporter, and she sponsored many young musicians, and that's one of the reasons why when the museum opened, she had the opening party was on New Year's Eve, and Boston Symphony Orchestra played for her because she had been such a kind patron to them, and she only served champagne and donuts.
Oh, yes, I know you were waiting, yeah.
So my grandmother, who I think went to Smith, she was a docent at the museum in the mid-1960s, and during the summer. And at the end of her last summer, she was invited up to have tea with Mrs. Gardner. And she said it was the most exhilarating hour of her life. It was like a big job interview. And she was asked questions of what sort of things on this particular table drew people's eyes more than others, and things like that. And then she was asked a lot of questions about what she wanted to do with her own. Unfortunately, I was too small, so I didn't ask enough questions first.
That's a great story. Thank you so much for sharing it. Yeah.
Is there something that you wanted in the book that either you decided not to put in or the editors cut out on?
Yes. Well, so the first thing is when I finished this novel, it was 550 pages. And I thought, well, that's not really gonna be book club length. And I knew that I needed to trim it, and I knew that having, my editor is great, and she helped me sort of tighten some things. But then there were certain scenes that I had to cut, really not because I loved them. And there's one particular one that I'm thinking of. So Isabella gets to travel around and meet different artists, and one of the places she goes is to New Bedford, which was at the time the wealthiest city in the country. Which is amazing, I think, for some people to know. But when she was there, I had her interact. There are all sorts of little cameos that show up. As I said, there are a million famous people, and she knew them all. And she really did. She knew Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and different things like that. And when she's at the Chicago World's Fair, she meets, Harry Houdini, but I had to cut all those little things like that. But the scene that I really regret cutting, which maybe will make an appearance in the paperback, I'm not sure, is she goes to New Bedford, and I had her interact with Hetty Green. And I'm not sure if people know who Hetty Green is, but she was called the Witch of Wall Street. And she was the wealthiest woman in the country at the time. She had been born to a big stock banking guy, and he never had sons. And so he used to, from the time she was 2 years old, have Hetty read the stock and trading paper to him.
Wow.
And so she invested very, very wisely, and she was incredibly wealthy. And I had them interact because the way Isabella has come into her own money, and she's trying to figure out what she wants to do with it. And she does have this sort of moral feeling that she would like to bring art to the public and make art accessible to the public. But what she bumps into Hetty Green, and Hetty Green, despite being the wealthiest woman in the world, in the country, lived in a boarding house. She didn't have hot water by choice. She wore the same dress day in, day out. She scrubbed the edges of it with an old bar of soap. And so I have them interact because Hetty says to Isabella in this scene, you need to figure out what you want to do with your money and what brings you pleasure in life. And what I have figured out from my money is that what brings me pleasure is not spending the money, it's just having it. And you need to figure that out. And so Isabella has, at the museum, it says, c'est mon plaisir, over one of the doorways, the entryway. And she really did want people to experience pleasure and joy in her museum. And what she figured out was that she wanted to experience joy and pleasure by bringing art to the public. But I love this interaction between these two different women, both coming to grips with what it would mean for a woman to have their own money at the time.
It sounds as if you have enough for another book.
I do.
And do you think that it will become a movie? I know
There's some interest, but we'll have to see what happens. It's out within Hollywood.
Or
now that the strike,
series,
the strike is over, yes.
Right after the Gilded Age, and we're all done, and we have no more episodes, we can watch this.
Yeah, I know.
We take like 2 or 3 more, and then we can move to the signing.
Okay, perfect.
And if there's nothing else, then I can sing.
Yes, family things. You could ask her to do Britney Spears. Just kidding. We were teasing her today. My co-host Scott, sings as well. Anyone else have questions? If not,
Yeah,
we can ask a little bit.
Are you working on anything right now?
Oh, thanks for asking. I am working on something. I won't tell you exactly her name, but it's about another overlooked woman in history. But this time, this novel is set in around 1815, 1820, in England and in Switzerland and France and all sorts of European artists, and sort of a group of famous artists with one woman at the center of it all. So sort of art and writing and a lot of it a scandal.
Okay,
So thank you for asking.
I wanted to know, as an author myself, I always wonder, what's your process like? Are you disciplined? Do you get up every morning? Do you have a certain number of hours? Do you write on paper? Do you write on the computer? You write wherever you are?
Yeah. So I am an early to bed, early to rise, always have been. So I go to bed I'm like a toddler. I go to bed at around 9 or 9:30 and I wake up at 5.
Yeah.
And I write from 5 to 7. And I have 4 kids, only one of them still at home because they aged amazingly. We didn't get that happen. They're not toddlers anymore. But so once I get the 16-year-old out the door, I go for a run and then I come back and I basically keep school hours and I work until about 3. And then my brain starts to power down and I can basically only think about plants and food. I do a lot of plant propagation and I love to cook. But I think I do write every day. I always am thinking about things, but I write across genre. You know, this is book number 24. And so I never know whether I'm going to be working on it. I just finished another poetry collection, whether I'm going to be doing short stories or a screenplay or a novel. And so, but I make sure that I show up every day. So I think one of the reasons I've been able to publish as much as I have is my art is an art, but it's also a job. And, you know, I've never needed to, I just have trained myself. I don't need inspiration or the right kind of pen, although I do love a fountain pen, but I don't need it. And I can write on paper or a computer or a typewriter or, you know, the best ones are the CVS receipts because they're about this. Basically write a novel on the back of them. So I'll write anytime, any place.
Okay, yeah, so interesting.
But every day.
Yeah,
Wow.
I wonder,
well, I know that there are a lot of you here and you probably all want to get signed and things, but yeah.
But I just want to thank you for being such a great conversation partner with me and earlier on TV and here. And I want to thank all of you for coming out in support of books and literature and the arts. It's so important and I'm so grateful to all of you and to supporting such a great bookstore. I love RJ Julia. I love doing events here. And I hope you all will consider the book as a read or a holiday gift. And thank you again for supporting the arts.